Deanna Beals.
Samantha Bradford. And this week we read Search Chapter 5, which talks about testing, especially standardized testing, and how that works in schools. And Mr. Noguera, he starts off and he talks about how since the No Child Left Behind Act, we've kind of just been testing for the sake of testing in America without focusing on actual growth and resolving issues. But he does acknowledge that testing is an important way to know where to look, to kind of diagnose what issues, what demographics need help, to kind of point us in the direction that we need to focus our attention. And he talks about how since the ESSA, since that act, states have been given more freedom to determine the frequency of standardized testing, how to test. So some states are kind of exploring a variety of new options now, which is really good. And he also talks about the importance of helping kids who are in poverty, because when their basic needs aren't being met, when they, are going to bed hungry and when they don't have, electricity, heat, internet at home and stuff like that, they're going to do worse in school and on standardized tests, and that's just not fair.
Mr. Hess kind of talks about how he thinks testing is really, really important because it does allow us to kind of see where students are at, but he doesn't say it's necessarily the best thing that we can do to gauge where they are. So he thinks like the accountability portion is really, really important, but it's not everything. And he thinks a lot of the school systems are really focused too much on the test preparation in the classrooms that the teachers aren't necessarily focusing so much on like science and other things that don't necessarily apply to it, the tests, but rather they're just focusing on like, let's teach them math, let's teach them reading with everything that's going to be on there because it's going to demonstrate their performance at the end of the day. And he says at the end that test scores aren't necessarily an accurate representation of the performance of the school, but rather just like those students at that specific time. So he wants to make testing more like an appointment, like going to the dentist or the pediatrics, where you're able to go and get instant feedback and have it be a conversation between you instead of just like, oh, here's your scores and that's it.
Mr. Noguera totally agrees with Mr. Hess about standardized testing and how it should be more like a pediatric checkup. But he also talks about how standardized testing like the SATs cater towards the well-off and how they have access to tutoring and things that less fortunate kids don't, and so they're going to do better. And he talks about how College Board literally profits off of people taking their tests, but we need to step back and ask, is that what's best for the students? Like, not what's best for the College Board institution itself. And he talks about how we don't even know if standardized tests are accurate evaluations of how students are doing because, you know, maybe on the day of the test, the student was tired or hungry or they didn't get sleep the night before. And besides, the tests aren't really used to help the kids because, like the ones in eighth grade nationwide, you don't typically get results until the next school year. And then you're in a different class, you have a different teacher. It's not as helpful anymore. And he brings up portfolios as an alternative where teachers could collect samples of student work over time, and then that could be a potentially more accurate evaluation of how students do than a one day, one time test.
Service agrees. He says it's something that's really, really hard. It's a complicated thing to understand how to fix, because it's a really important thing to be able to like have that accountability, the test scores, but like, is it actually something that's going to benefit the students at the end of the day? He also talks about the SAT and the ACT. He thinks they're important things because they can kind of act as a buffer between the test scores, because a lot of times you'll have those state test scores that people are tested at, which can be different based on the schooling that you get. But you also have the SAT and ACT where it's a nationwide score. So you're able to kind of be ranked against kids against across the nation. But there's a lot of discrepancies because a lot of people have different preparation levels, where you have kids who might be in poverty or don't have the ability to afford to take the SAT, or they don't have the resources to study, to have a tutor, to get textbooks to study for it. Whereas you have those kids that have been prepared forever basically to take these tests, and so they're at a um higher ability to take them. He also believes that state testing still plays a useful role, even though it kind of takes away in the classroom setting, just because they are able to see some data, but it's not effective because they, like she was saying, it you don't get it back right away. It's something that comes later on, and you have different teachers. He loves the idea of the portfolios because it is more individualized and it is over a range of time. But what about its practicality? He thinks it's better to have teachers do just little assessments here and there instead of just having these test scores that you just see over a range of time.
To kind of wrap up, Mr. Noguera moves on to the point of, okay, if our diagnostics are telling us that certain schools aren't doing well, what do we do with those schools? And he says that the kind of current predominant American approach is to use threats and pressure and intimidation as a strategy for change. That states will take over, that states will take over schools that are struggling or fire teachers and administrators, but this drives valued professionals away from the teaching field, and there's no evidence it really helps those schools improve. So instead suggests we implement the Canadian strategy of a capacity building approach, where we send targeted help to schools rather than just put pressure on them. So if a school is struggling in math, we send really proficient math teachers to that school to teach the kids how to do better, to teach the teachers how to do better, and that way we're improving the system as a whole.
Mr. Has closes where he talks about the three things that make good teaching is where you have instruction, assessment, and diagnosis, where you're able to teach the students, you're able to assess what they're doing, and to kind of figure out where you can improve. He also says that we shouldn't just leave schools to do their own things because at the end of the day, there needs to be that accountability to make sure that students are being taught what they need to be taught. Um, and so it's not like you don't have the police where there's no accountability there. You have to have some accountability, so they can't just go do their own thing. And then he kind of closes where he talks about how we need to figure out what to do when schools are failing. We can't just close them down because that's not an effective strategy, but rather how can we help improve them? And then going into the praxis portion of this in my own classroom, I really want to try to focus on the needs of each of my students and where they're falling short instead of just basing them on like those test score standards. Because at the end of the day, that's not going to be accurate representation. As teachers, we are able to see them on a daily basis and to see where they've been struggling. We know a lot of times what's been going on at home. Sometimes we don't. But we're able to understand the students. And so if we're able to do little assessments in our classrooms from time to time to kind of gauge where they're at, I think that's going to be a lot more effective in the long run than just testing them on like just state testing, because that not isn't going to be an accurate representation, because especially a lot of kids aren't good at testing in general, but they might be better at other things.
In my classroom, I want to make sure that my students have a well-rounded education, that they are educated in more things than what they're just going to be tested on, more than just reading and math, that they're going to have exposure to science, to the arts, to current events, things like that. And that not only are my students going to have a well-rounded education, but that they will be prepared for standardized testing if that is going to be an inevitable part of the American school system. That everyone will be prepared, because some students, yes, they'll have their parents will probably afford them tutors outside of school and they'll have help, but I want to make sure that those students, even the ones who are have less economic opportunity, will be able to feel prepared for those tests. And as far as reflection goes, to wrap up, I definitely agree that I don't love standardized tests. I don't think it's super accurate to make kids sit down for 4 hours in one day and say that's indicative of how they are, how intelligent they are, and things like that, and how much they've learned. I just don't think that's true. And the SATs do bug me a bit. I definitely agree with Mr. Noguera that they are kind of biased towards the wealthy, because lots of students like me couldn't afford to take the SAT time after time after time. You got your one chance and that was it. And then I knew other students who were more well off who they would pay to take the SAT, they'd take it the first time, wouldn't like their score, and then they would pay for tutors and like education programs, and then they would pay to take the SAT again. And they could pay to take the test 4 or 5 times, whereas a lot of students could only afford to take it once or twice. And so I just don't think that's necessarily fair and showing. I think it leaves less well-off students kind of down here, and it makes more well-off students look like they're more intelligent when it might not be accurate.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. I think it's important to have some sort of like accountability there with the things that the students are teaching to see where they're at. But I think it should be more on a personal level. Like you were saying, like kind of like the idea of portfolios. Yes, the practicality isn't necessarily great because it's hard to do across like a widespread nation. But to be able to do that, just like in your own classroom, to see where your students need help. I really like the idea that Ms. Noguera brought up about having, I think it was in an institution in Canada where they were able to bring in specialized teachers to help the kids that might be struggling with math specifically or reading. So that way they're able to get the help that they need instead of just focusing, hey, we have this big standardized test coming up. We need to make sure you know this, and this, so that way you can pass this test. And a lot of times, like I remember growing up taking these assessments, like they would like threaten us in the sense of like, oh, if you don't pass this test, we're gonna hold you back and you're going to have to stay back a grade. Or if you don't do good enough on this, we're going to have to place you in lower classes. And so it's just being able to find ways to help empower your students, to help them be confident in the things that they're learning in the classroom, and still making it fun where it's not just all about the testing that they're doing.